Continuing this discussion of boundaries, now that we've discussed areas in which setting boundaries is important, let's turn our attention to the types of boundaries. In relationships, one can have balanced, rigid, or porous boundaries. So let's take a look at rigid boundaries first. Rigid boundaries in relationships refer to an extreme form of boundary setting characterized by inflexibility and strictness. So, people with rigid boundaries tend to have overly strict rules, regulations, or limitations, making it challenging for others to connect with them on an emotional or personal level. Here's some characteristics of rigid boundaries in relationships. Unyielding standards. Individuals with rigid boundaries often have extremely high standards for themselves and others. It's giving perfectionists. They may expect perfection in behavior, communications, or interactions, which makes it extremely difficult for them or their partners to meet those unrealistic expectations. Lack of flexibility. So there's little room for negotiation or compromise. Like stubborn to the max, the utmost, just because these individuals may refuse to adapt or make any adjustments in the relationship, even when it could benefit both parties. Emotional distance. Rigid boundaries can create emotional distance in relationships. In fact, in most cases, that is the intention of the rigid boundary. If I can keep people away from me emotionally, I can limit the amount of emotional damage that they can inflict. People with rigid boundaries might avoid emotional intimacy, vulnerability, or sharing personal experiences purposefully to keep the interaction superficial. They may also control with an iron fist which emotional avenues they will explore in a very controlling manner. Difficulty in empathy. So understanding or empathizing with others' feelings, needs, or perspectives may be challenging for those with rigid boundaries. It can feel narcissistic in a way because they may struggle to acknowledge or validate other people's emotions. Rigid boundaries are insulating in efforts to keep all of myself to myself. Therefore, it's not prudent to try to empathize with others because then I have to account for those people's feelings, emotions, and etc. So, controlled interactions. People with rigid boundaries may control conversations, situations, or decisions within the relationship, unwilling to consider alternative viewpoints or compromises. Isolation. So, these rigid boundaries can lead to isolation or alienation from others. The inflexibility might deter people from seeking closeness or maintaining relationships with those who have very, very rigid boundaries. So the result can be strained relationships. So such boundaries can strain relationships because partners or individuals close to them might feel kind of shut out, unheard, or rejected due to the lack of flexibility and any kind of emotional connection with the person who has rigid boundaries. It's important to note that while boundaries are critical and crucial for healthy relationships, extreme rigidity or inflexibility in setting these boundaries can hinder relationship growth, can hinder relationship communication, and can hinder emotional connection overall. Again, we want to be very cognizant that you can have rigid boundaries in one area and more porous boundaries in another area, and maybe even balanced boundaries in another area. So they can change depending on the relationship. That is kind of healthy. If you have somebody who is a very toxic individual, you might have rigid boundaries with them. So their rigid boundaries are not always negative. You just want to be cognizant that if all boundaries have rigid lines and are inflexible, that can lead to relationship struggles and can lead to relationship chaos, right? And feeling very isolated in your relationships. So be cognizant of that.